Today, it's the end of the world as we know it. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, one that is post covering finance and property news. Tarek Brooker's back for another chat. Tarek, hello, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you too, mate. Plenty to talk about.
Yeah, we do seem to be in a bit of omni-channels, and there's a lot going on. And, trying to separate noise from signal is really quite important at the moment. There are so many conflicting stories about this and that and the other. But of course, it's all centered around the action in Iran at the moment. And we're going to explore that in some detail today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've got quite a few slides on that. I've been doing quite a bit of research, had a few articles into that, which I'll get you to link in the description down below. And, it really is true that, if certain people push certain buttons, that we could be living in a very different world in a few months.
Yes, and I think that the signs are already there. So, even simple things, for example, like the oil price, right? So the oil price, this is the Brent oil, and you can see there that it's sitting at around 85. Now that's up, but just to remind everybody that in 2022 it peaked at 130. And another little data point here is the gas price. So this is actually another way of looking. This is the TFF, natural gas futures, up. But again, you can see that it's spiked dramatically higher at the moment. So the question, of course, is, Tarek, are we simply in the foothills of what's going on? In other words, are we going to see prices rise even higher? People are already talking about disruptive air travel for months and months and months. But I'm not sure that the energy story alone really tells us the full story.
No, because this could turn into something quite unreal from a geopolitical perspective. You could see Iran fracture. You could see, civil war. I mean, there's reports in the media about Iranian Kurds being armed by the CIA for an insurgency against the Iranian regime. There are some reports in some quarters of the Azerbaijani populace of Iran, of which there is a sizable number in northwestern Iran, of them potentially engaging in conflict. I mean, there's a lot, as you say, there's a lot of noise going on, and it's very hard to know what's true and what's not. But there is those possibilities there. And just in our little corner of the backyard, I'm not sure if you've seen it, but it's kicking around on Twitter, of the Singapore jet fuel prices. And jet fuel today in Singapore is more expensive than it was at the height of the panic surrounding the war in Ukraine. So, and not only that, but guess where some of Australia's jet fuel comes from, Martin?
Yes, it could well be from that direction. And of course, if you look at the costs of, for example, getting hold of one of those big tankers, that cost has gone absolutely through the roof. And insurance is almost not possible for so it was actually not just physical closing the Hormuz Straits, but actually it was the insurance industry saying, well, we ain't insuring you, so you stop. So it's interesting how the financial markets and the financial system is overlaid on the physical realities of what's going on in the Middle East at the moment. And just bearing in mind, of course, that Iran has hit out with attacks on a whole bunch of different countries in the region, so effectively widening the aperture of the issue. I also feel very sorry for those people who are caught in the crossfire, literally and metaphorically. There are people stuck in places they didn't want to be stuck in, traveling through and not traveling on, but also the locals too. And I am minded to just remind everybody that, historically, the ancient civilization of Persia was actually, one of the wonders of the world, if you go back in history.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Persia was a great power for quite a long time, and it's one of its Parthia, its precursor was, Parthia, Persia. It's been both over the years, but they were a long time rival of the Romans, and Crassus had a really fun time going to Persia. So it's gonna be interesting, because I think the thing is that this isn't one of those things where we really know how it's going to play out. I think that you're in a situation where you're looking at sort of, imagine you've got a tree, right? And all of the roots go out into the ground and branch out in all these different directions. And I feel like at the moment we are at the base of that tree, heading down those roots, and it could go all manner of different ways. A lot of them not very good, and I think that that's really problematic. And I think part of the problem as well in this instance is that I feel like the rules have changed
Mm.
somewhat. You know, like the US is acting much more blatantly in its own self-interest. And the question is like, Trump can take Iran off the table from a geopolitical perspective for Russia, for China. He can turn it into a failed state if he chooses to just keep bombing, but that will have costs. That will have costs for the region, naturally, and for the Iranian people, especially. But it will also have costs for Europe. Because if you turn a nation the size of Iran with the best part of 100 million people into a failed state, you're going to start a refugee crisis. But then by the same token, if you turn it into a failed state, you're going to have all manner of extremists have their hands on the remnants of the military power of Iran, lobbing whatever they want into the people that they don't like, which could keep the Strait of Hormuz closed without sort of the overwhelming firepower to defend the shipping going through there. So there's all these very, very challenging scenarios that are well and truly possible, because if some of the media reports are to be believed, there isn't really that much of a well thought out plan of what the end game for all of this actually looks like. It's very much just sort of, we'll throw enough ordnance downrange and we'll figure it out.
Well, it's a bit like flooding the zone on a mega scale, isn't it? I mean, it's the same sort of philosophy, really. And it's interesting. I did note that the US just has announced that they will allow Russia to export more oil. And guess where that's going to impinge, right? So that's back onto the Ukraine situation and everything there. So these things have consequences well beyond the immediate region. And yeah, I don't know whether you listened to Mark Carney this week, but I thought he was quite interesting, again, calling out the middle powers to stick to the rules and work together. And I'm thinking, well, that's all very well, but when mega powers just say, well, mate, we're just going to use our heavy boots and we'll do what we want in our own interests, which is dictatorial, and mercenary, of course. But it is the nature of the world. And I suppose the thought that I've always had here is that we've always known that below the surface, these big, powerful players were able to pull the strings all sorts of different ways and exert their muscle around. But now it's so overt. Another reason why perhaps the world will never be the same again.
No, I think the thing is that I think you're right. I think that you've always had the iron fist inside the glove, but for most of our lifetimes, for most of the viewers' lifetimes, it's being, in the velvet glove. It's being, cloaked in the claims of the rules-based international order. It's been cloaked in, police actions and all these sorts of different terminologies that people like to use. But the truth is it's always been about power. It's always been about capability. Like you look back at, even just the last, 25 years, Afghanistan, Iraq, Ukraine, all these other problems that we've had in the world. And what's happened? The superpowers have thrown their weight around, and then pretty much nothing happens. And I mean, okay, you've got like some sanctions and stuff here and there, and obviously it's harder for Russia than it is for the Americans, but no one's going to turn around and impose sanctions on America, not in any serious way. And, we do live in a world where, might not necessarily be right, but might is what it is. And I think that takes us to a very different world in terms of how I think people will perceive things. But by the same token, it is just how things have actually always been. I think for a lot of people, like myself, who either grew up in the developing world or spent a lot of time in the developing world, none of this is going to be a surprise. Because that's just how it functions. Because if you're from the developing world, if your nation was involved in the Cold War, chances are some distasteful stuff happened there. I mean, in the majority of places. And chances are the European powers, whether it was the Soviet Union or whether it was the Americans, were involved in that. And chances are that not all of that was to your interests as a citizen or someone who has their origins in one of those nations. So for people like that, it's just like today is indeed a Friday.
Mm. And it's worth just reflecting, if you go back 100 years plus, well, Britain was, stomping around the Middle East and creating mayhem then. The US has been doing it more recently. And of course, you've listed some of those failed operations in the Middle East where effectively, there were objectives or not clear objectives in some cases, in other cases, a little bit more clear, but didn't really work out. But it's a mess. It's an absolute mess. And it's, I think, a problem when you've got large players who exert their muscles for their own interests. And, I mentioned earlier on people getting caught in the crossfire. The truth is, the story is millions and millions of people have been displaced and many have been killed over a long, long period of time. A lot of it directly or indirectly connected with, guess what? Liquid gold or oil.
The thing with the Brits, right? You look at say someone like Lawrence of Arabia, right? Someone who had a great knowledge of the Middle East, someone who understood the way all of the different pieces fit together in a way that I don't think a lot of people do today. I don't think that people really immerse themselves in the culture, immerse themselves in the history, and understand how the Middle East works, because it doesn't work like the West. Most places in the world don't work entirely like the West.
That's true.
But the problem is that, that they went into Iraq and they thought, oh, we're gonna rebuild this place and it's all gonna be hunky dory and everything's gonna be great. And they ended up creating a situation that led to the rise of ISIS and, a long protracted period of civil war in Iraq and, all sorts of shenanigans across the region, because there wasn't really what would you call it? There wasn't really a cohesive, well thought out long-term plan of how exactly they were going to re-engineer Iraq and then leave. And there was the same problem in Afghanistan. And I think the problem is now they've identified that was a problem, which is in a vacuum a positive. But now the answer is no longer putting boots on the ground, or at least I very much hope it isn't. It's just to chuck ordnance downrange and see what happens. Because at the end of the day, the blowback isn't really America's problem in terms of, the direct impact from Iran. But obviously there are second and third order effects to be considered.
Well, everything's connected, isn't it? And, we've only got one planet and we've got to try to live on this one planet and people chucking rocks at each other. Also, of course, the other point there is the drill baby drill philosophy of the US means that they are actually one of the biggest exporters of oil and gas as well. So there's actually a whole big commercial thread there too. Plus, of course, a huge and expanding military and parallel industries sector, which is huge as well. And if you look at the recent stock market movements, stocks dropped, but actually some of those military and commercial operators who are actually working in that sector are booming at the moment. So, all of these are weird and complex consequences. And, as an ordinary household sitting in the middle of Australia, you might think, well, can I just ignore it and carry on? The trouble is that actually all of these decisions that have been taken or will be taken and the fallout, it's coming, right? And wherever you are, there are significant implications. And we're going to try and get into some of those potential implications, I think, as we discuss this. And you've put some slides together, Tarek. So why don't we roll into them?
We certainly shall. As usual, the charts can be found at burneteconomics.com. I just want to say thank you to all the people who have subscribed recently. It has been absolutely great to see the response from the community. There will also be links in the description to all the articles referenced, and also a link to my YouTube channel where there'll be some of the clips from all of my various chats with Martin. So we'll get right into it. Now, this is a really, really great chart from Goldman Sachs. what this shows is the volume of oil and oil-based products. And when I say all oil-based, I'm talking about, diesel, crude oil, gas, you name it. So this is the volume of oil through the Strait of Hormuz on a 3-day moving average. And as you can see, it has absolutely collapsed. It is basically nothing. Now, there are some reports to suggest that this is a result. My apologies. There are some reports to suggest that there are some ships passing through the strait with their transponders turned off, and this is distorting the data somewhat. But even if you go based on the visual confirmation via satellite, you're still talking about the number of ships passing through the strait in the low single digits compared with the mid dozens previously. So this just illustrates the scale of the problem. You're talking about basically over 1/5 of the world's total oil and oil-based products being taken off the table. Now, I think that needs just an additional little layer of context, because it's all well and good to say, okay, it's 1/5 of the total global consumption. But what that doesn't tell you is it doesn't tell you to what degree it is the proportion of global exports. Because you've got, say, for example, the United States. The United States makes a great deal of oil. It also uses a great deal of oil domestically. China uses a great deal of its own oil domestically. So does Russia. So does a whole manner of country. Nigeria. The list goes on. So it is a much, much greater proportion of global oil exports that have been completely taken off the table. So this is a big deal. There was one report this morning that suggested that the disruption to global oil supplies will be 3 times larger than the kickoff of the oil crisis in 1973. So this isn't just, oh my, we've got a problem. This is, if it continues over a long period of time, quite possibly, as the title of the video suggests, the end of the world as we know it.
Yeah, and 2 observations. Firstly, of course, not all is equal. So there are different types of oil, and some of the sweeter, more easier to process actually comes out of this area, which is the first point. And the second point is that I was around in the 1970s, and I was in the UK at the time, and they actually issued ration books for oil. And that was because they were so concerned about the supply versus demand. And, it didn't actually ever get activated, but we got really, really close. And it got to the point where people were actually unable to travel because they couldn't get sufficient supply to be able to travel. So the fallout was dramatic. These days, because of the nature of the way that society works, of course, we've got lots of delivery vans popping around and delivering all over the place. So actually, the mix and demand for oil and the way it works in a society is also different now as well. So the bottom line is, you're right. If these things play on rather than actually get fixed quick, and I think most markets are still assuming, if you look at the forward prices, they're not as bad as the current spot prices at the moment. So most people are assuming it'll be a short, sharp thing. But I'm not sure that short and sharp is necessarily the thematic that we should hang to.
No, I mean, like some analysts now are talking about this being over by September. So you're talking about potentially, 6 months of this. 6 months of this is going to take a wrecking ball to the global economy. Because, and not only that, but I think that we're going to see, if that does come to pass, right? If we're sitting here in 6 months and we're still discussing this and everything is basically roughly status quo with where it is today, we are going to be sitting here talking about the most idiotic, large-scale deployment of government cash outside of COVID in the history of the world.
Yep.
It is going to be Bernard economics on steroids. They're going to throw so much money at the economy to try and prevent bad things from happening. But, throwing money at the economy in a supply shock, well, we know how that ends, don't we? From, 2022, 2023, 2024.
Sounds inflationary. And of course, already there are expectations of future rate cuts in the US off the table, and rate rises. Of course, we had the first one in Australia recently, and more rate rises ahead too. So, yeah, the fallout and the consequences are pretty dramatic. And I'd also make the point, as we'll come on to, it isn't just oil and gas. There are other things to think about too, in terms of some other commodities that we'll come on to. Plus, of course, there is a bunch of communication facilities that run through the Hormuz Straits, right, relating to the internet. And I would remind everybody that I think it's about 6 of the really mega pipes are in that very area too. So if things got really nasty, we might suddenly find that international communications got also hit.
No, indeed, that there's all manner of things that stem from the Middle East that we don't really appreciate in terms of, like, it's very easy to just look at things and go, oh, well, it's about the oil. And it's only about the oil, because for a long time that was very much true. But the problem is over time, the Gulf states have all, to varying degrees, diversified their economies into other products, particularly oil-based products, whether it be plastics, whether it be fertilizer, whether it be all manner of different things made as a byproduct of the hydrocarbons industry. So you've got this issue now where all of that is part of these interlinked global supply chains. And we live in a just-in-time world. This isn't like, the world, of the perhaps of the 1950s and the 1960s, where there was built-in redundancies. All that was cut as fat by corporations, by even just academic convention, as the perception of things changed to maximize profits rather than maximize resilience.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting to note that, of course, corporate profits are still very strong. So the stock markets are actually still pretty high. They've come back slightly, but pretty high. And the forward estimates from analysts are still that corporate profits will be very high next year as well. Now, this was before the recent events, so that may change now. But it does ask the question as to, well, who are the winners and who are the losers? And I think there are going to be a small number of winners, particularly affluent people and some of the big corporates, but many losers, I'm afraid, as well.
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? I think that we've got a situation whereby, unfortunately, governments no longer accept economic downside the way that they once did. And that's a problem. People see economic downside through this lens of the individual household, but that's not really how it's viewed in politics. It's viewed as what happens with markets, what happens with all these other different things. It's not just about individual households. I mean, take Australia, for instance, right? In Australia, real household disposable income per capita has gone, adjusting for the increases in the labour force participation rate, employment to population ratio, and the shift in the working age, the shift in the population towards a greater number of working age people, real household disposable income per capita has basically gone nowhere in 13 years. But is that a political problem? Up until now, not really.
No, it's very interesting. And, the data that came out yesterday, which was the household spending indicators, and I did a show on it actually, because it's worth actually understanding what it doesn't include. It only includes a small chunk of household spending, so it's not really that accurate in many ways. But what's fascinating there is if you actually look at it in real terms, it's actually not good news there at the moment either. So households aren't spending more. They're spending more on what they have to buy rather than what they would like to buy. And in fact, of course, the GDP number, well, it showed that from a productivity perspective, there was no improvement in productivity when you look at it in terms of the hours versus the income generated.
Yeah, Mark the Graph on Twitter put up a really interesting chart on that. And basically, he did multi-factor productivity over time rather than just labor productivity. And once you sort of look at the productivity from that broader perspective, we're going absolutely nowhere, and nothing is getting better. And then you compare that with living standards, with all these other different indicators, particularly from the perspective of perhaps more average households. And when I say average, I mean like just like regular everyday people,
Mm.
rather than an average of households, which tends to be distorted by the more affluent ones.
Yep.
We're not going anywhere fast. So it really is a really challenging situation to begin with. And then we're throwing this entire other set of circumstances into the mix. And yeah, I mean, we were speed running the 1930s, but someone may have just pressed the fast forward button at this rate.
Exactly right. Now, let's come back to the Hormuz Straits and actually understand a bit more about it, because for many people, it's sort of a blurry mess, right? I know there's a canal somewhere, and I know there are oil states somewhere, and I know that people have to move it around, but a lot of people haven't really sort of figured it all out. So let's look at a map.
Yeah, this is from S&P Global Energy, and it is probably the best map I've seen on this. Now, what it shows is the various oil pipelines running across the Middle East, how much oil is passing through the various different maritime choke points. And it also just shows some of the alternatives to the Strait of Hormuz, because in the middle there, you've got the east-west pipeline across Saudi Arabia. Now, that can take, theoretically, up to about 7 million barrels a day of oil, which is actually, in a vacuum, very, very good news. Because as of prior to the war, only about 1.5 million barrels per day of oil was flowing through that. So there's a fair bit of capacity there to be to increase the scope of oil exports from Saudi Arabia, which is very good news for the Saudis. If oil prices spike, they'll probably be better off financially in terms of their oil revenue than they would have been had the war not happened at all. Then in the UAE, there is also a pipeline to the Gulf of Oman, which is worth about 1.5 million barrels per day, which will also give some capacity, provided that remains operational. The terminals there were hit by the remnants of an Iranian drone strike, which did do some damage. So basically, there is the scope there to increase the amount of oil flowing around the Strait of Hormuz. Now, that all up adds up to about 6.4 million barrels a day of oil being able to transit around the Strait of Hormuz. The problem is, if you look across all the various different sources of oil and oil-based products, that is about a third. So even though there are those options, which are very good for those particular nations who have them, that is deeply problematic for the world. Now, there is one other mention, which is the pipeline that runs to Turkey from Iraq. That's worth about 1.2, 1.3 million barrels per day. So it is another significant factor. But that pipeline, from what I can ascertain, is currently closed for political and legal reasons. Now, in a pinch, I can imagine they could probably have their arm twisted to fire it up again. But either way, it still all comes up far short of what is required to basically keep all the plates spinning for the world and keep enough oil flowing that it's not going to cause this enormous disruption.
Yeah, it is an amazingly complex situation. And also make one other point. We're talking here about the transportation of oil, but of course, Iran has actually been targeting oil production infrastructure as well. And so what that means is that even if you actually have some of those transport links open again, some of those production facilities could well be damaged and might be offline for some time. And in fact, in some cases, they've already claimed force majeure.
Well, therein lies the biggest problem in all of this, and probably the most nightmarish scenario for the world. If Iran starts to target oil infrastructure, things like oil pipelines, oil production facilities, in particular oil export facilities, wholesale, and they start directing the full scope of their remaining arsenal at those targets, at this stage, at the time of this video's recording, they have the scope to basically decimate it. Now, to what degree they can decimate it, that's a matter of debate. But they can smash it hard enough that it's going to take a very long time before production can be resumed. And in which case, it doesn't really matter if the Strait of Hormuz is closed, because there's not going to be enough oil flowing potentially for it to really matter. So, but the question is, how does all this play out? You know, does that happen? Do the Iranians realize that they're done? That they may as well take the biggest possible swing on the way down and remake the world? And you know, all of these are very good questions. And I think the problem is that at this stage, we just don't know. I mean, as long as they think they can survive, destroying them doesn't really make sense, because because if you destroy them, they're gonna come for you, and they're gonna make you pay, and they will, you know, if you destroy the world as we know it by destroying all of, you know, most of the Middle East oil infrastructure, no one in the Iranian regime is going to survive that. But if they realize that the Americans are set on regime change, that they're not going to make it regardless, that they're done no matter what, then that becomes a much more attractive option for someone who just wants to go full scorched earth. So yeah, it's a possibility, and I think that it's an underpriced possibility, however small it may currently be, because it almost doesn't bear thinking about, because it just would smash the world so hard to be able to have to find 1 in 5 barrels of oil globally all over again. It means everything would have to change.
Yeah, and just a little observation here. Of course, the religious overlay here is that the believers will say martyrdom equals paradise equals a perfect future, right, in another world somewhere. And there's a bit of that in here too. So almost, well, if I'm going to go down, I'm going to actually, you know, blow everything else up too. So that is a very worrying thread.
Well, it is. I mean, you know, if you're going down anyway, and you can take the people that you consider to be, you know, your mortal enemies down with you, then I mean, I can understand how for a fanatic that would have a fair amount of appeal. You know, fighting to the last man in Berlin, so to speak.
Absolutely. But I think there's a broader perspective here too. And that is, as I said, other things are also caught up in this. So, you know, we might start thinking about oil, but think about fertilizer, for example. Fertilizer, actually, a lot of fertilizer that is used around the place comes from this area because, of course, it's a byproduct of the manufacturing and processing of oil.
It is, and that's what makes this chart from Kepler such a interesting piece of kit. Now, what this shows is what share of global exports is taken by each of these various categories. So there, of course, you've got crude oil in crude oil and condensates, I should say, as number 3 there with 30.9%. But at the top, as you can see, fertilizer, a third of the world's fertilizer. Now, you can get the oil and you can pipe it around, and you can at least keep some of that going as long as that infrastructure isn't impacted by the war. But fertilizer is massive. You know, fertilizer is very much a bulk commodity, and attempting to move that from the various port cities on the Gulf and then to other ports outside of the Gulf would be an extremely challenging, you know, dare I say, impossible endeavor. And if you look at the price of fertilizer already in some exchanges, it's already up almost 50% from its lows, heading up towards the highs seen during the war, the height of the impact of the war in Ukraine on global commodity markets. So that is just a deeply, deeply challenging set of circumstances. And then there's also the issue of LNG. You're talking about almost 20% of the world's LNG stuck there. You can't get LNG around either, because you'd need this whole new big shiny export facility and the pipelines to get it there. So it's a lot of different things. Even just regular old, just various minerals, 17% of the global total. So this isn't just going to be an inflationary event because of oil. If this plays out over a protracted period, say the 6 months that Fitch, I believe, was talking about, that's going to be a fairly inflationary environment. And I think this is one of the things that gets me about some of the people who are sort of cheering on the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. People saying, "Oh, well, now they can't use the oil and they have to do what's right for the planet." Guess what happens when you take a third of the world's fertilizer off the table? It's not generally going to be the Australians who go without the fertilizer. It's going to be the people who can least afford it, and that's where the crop yields are going to be the most impacted. And those are the people who are going to suffer the most. It's going to be people who suffer the most will be the people who have the least.
Again, it does seem to be a common thematic. And I also make the point, of course, that applying fertilizer is very time specific based on where the seasons are and when you sow your crops and when you need to harvest them. So in fact, it's even a small window of a month or two. If you can't get the fertilizer that you might need, well, it means that your crop yields could be way, way down on where it normally is, and that has profound consequences for the next year and the year after. So again, it's I think an example of, in the short term, people are saying, well, in a few weeks it might be all over, but no, the consequences are already being laid now for months and months and months down the track.
Absolutely, and I think one of the things as well with all of this is that it's about the knock-on effects through other industries as well. So you've got the direct impact on the fertilizer industry through the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. The problem is you're taking almost 19% of the world's LNG off the table, and gas is used to make fertilizer. So you're not just taking the capacity off the table, you're also increasing the cost base and also just the accessibility base in countries that manufacture fertilizer themselves. So there's just this cascade of different effects, of different issues that come from potentially locking off a sizable part of the industrial world.
And just a quick word on LNG, of course, the marginal price of electricity in Australia is driven by, guess what? Gas and the gas prices. So as gas prices rise, guess what happens? Electricity prices rise. So even if you can get the LNG, which in Australia you probably can because we're actually still generating it, the chances are that we'll be paying a lot more, and that's going to translate again to higher energy prices, which is again inflationary. So Chalmers, are you going to pony up some more money? Probably will.
Oh, I would certainly imagine so. And it's like I said on Twitter a few days ago when shortly after all this stuff kicked off. I said that if this crisis becomes protracted, I can totally see the Albanese government providing support for the housing market.
Yes, that's right. Oh, got to save the housing market, Tarek. Never mind anything else, but the housing market must be preserved.
Well, just imagine that. I mean, imagine the RBA has to raise rates to, let's just say something that even prior to this, I'm pretty sure Warren Hogan was talking about something heading up towards 5%.
Yep.
And he was one of the few people who called the resurgence in inflation absolutely spot on. And now, well, where does it stop? When you're going to be importing inflation, when you're going to have food inflation, when you're going to have all these other different various problems, if this becomes a protracted crisis, and interest rates go up, and people will struggle to keep up with the cost of living, and that's going to affect the labor market. I mean, all you really need to do is just look at 1973. Look at what happened there.
Yeah.
Look at what happened to the unemployment rate in between like 73 and about 75, 76. It was a very, very challenging time. And if we repeat that in relative terms, you see the sort of same relative rise in unemployment. Well, oh boy, the housing market's going to have all sorts of problems.
Absolutely. And of course, the financial stability implications, et cetera, in the background. Now, one of the interesting observation, of course, is some people are saying, well, okay, the Middle East is closed, but there's spare capacity in the place. In fact, there was overproduction of oil. That's why prices were so low. So maybe it's not really that bad.
No, that's an interesting one, because in the recent IEA oil market report, it said that there was over 4 million barrels a day of extra capacity in the market. Which you hear that and you go, well, that's pretty good. Over 4 million barrels, 4.35 billion, I believe it was. That's going to make a massive dent in the problems that we've got from the Middle East. Unfortunately, not. The problem is that most of that, over 3.3 million barrels of that, is in the Middle East. So it's not really accessible. I mean, one of the problems is, say, like with the Saudis, they have the ability to not maintain, get close to maintaining a sizable proportion, a sizable majority, I should say, of their current exports, but only their current exports. They can't use the pipeline infrastructure as it is to bring their spare capacity to market, because they just don't have the infrastructure for it. So if you look outside of the Persian Gulf, the actual total spare capacity is only about 1 million barrels a day. Of that, about 500,000 barrels a day is in Kazakhstan. And Kazakhstan exports its oil via the Russian Black Sea ports. So one would imagine that a man by the name of Vladimir Putin may want a little something in return for this additional oil transiting his nation. And, we're already seeing Russia coming back to the forefront with the waivers being provided by the Trump administration for the Indians to purchase what was, and I guess still technically is, sanctioned Russian oil.
Yeah, shows you that the dynamics is very, very concerning. And again, I feel that some of those early knee-jerk responses, there's plenty of capacity, it's not an issue, are actually a little bit, away from the truth. And I'll just remind everybody, markets are assuming a short-term disruption and then back to normal. Well, what we're suggesting is that the normal that we're talking about, the new normal, might be rather different.
Well, therein lies the problem. I mean, like, there's the thing that, yes, the war could be over tomorrow. It could be over in, the closure of the relative closure, I should say, of the Strait of Hormuz could be over in, 3 to 5 days. That's what Goldman was talking about. And maybe it will be. It's entirely within the realm of possibility. But I don't think that markets are looking at this in terms of the possibility of a much, much more protracted, excuse me, a much, much more protracted crisis. And there's some interesting charts kicking about around this, and that basically it shows that markets don't tend to correctly price in crises surrounding energy prices very well.
Yep.
If you look at the war in Ukraine, if you look at the first Gulf War, energy markets didn't react the way you might think. They actually took quite a while to actually go, "Oh, the oil's been impacted. We better start pricing this in." So something that you would think would happen very, very rapidly actually occurred over a matter of, in some cases, weeks and months. So I think that we've got a really interesting dynamic here of the fact that the market isn't really pricing that in. It's still pricing in a sort of nothing ever happens, everything goes back to normal sort of thing. And I think that there's a lot more uncertainty about in all of this than that really prices in, to be completely honest with you.
Yeah, and another factor that is behind some of this uncertainty, if you think about it, is the Kurds and the Kurdish story, right? Because this is another angle that I'm not sure that many people have woken up to yet.
No, it's an interesting one, and it's something that we've seen elsewhere in the Middle East multiple times over the years. Because the Kurdish population, the sort of looking at it in terms of we'll say the largest, most concentrated areas of the Kurdish population are in Iran, Iraq, and Turkey. and I should say, and Syria. And in Syria and Iraq, on multiple occasions, the Kurds have been armed to fight the wars of the West. The Kurds were armed to fight ISIS. The Kurds were armed to fight Saddam Hussein twice. And the thing is that in both instances, things didn't end well for them. The Kurdish people of Syria now live under the rule of a leader who was once on the CIA's most wanted list and led the Syrian affiliate of Al Qaeda. So things didn't turn out very well for them in the end, which is sad because they fought absolutely tooth and nail, and that is something that is very much universal from the various people, including Australian soldiers who fought alongside them in those various wars. But as you can see from the map here of Iran, both on the left here, that is solely of Kurdish villages by the proportion of the population which is Kurdish. And on the right, we have another map, which is just a broader ethnic map of Iran, but it also shows what areas are Sunni and what areas are Shia. And as you can see, Iran is almost Yugoslavia-like in terms of its very varied ethnic makeup and very varied sectarian makeup. And there is already news reports that have emerged of the Iranian Kurds being armed by the CIA to fight against the Iranian regime, and also also to a degree also the Iraqi Kurds. So it's very very messy. It's always been very very messy, and there is that potential for sectarian conflict and for this all to just turn into an absolute mess. Because if the Iranian regime does fall, there will be that push in some quarters for these areas to gain their independence, or for them to join their like, say, for example, there's some estimates put the number of ethnically Azerbaijani people in Iran at a level greater than the total population of Azerbaijan. So, there is that thing of, if it turns into a mess, does Azerbaijan step in and protect people who are ethnic, their ethnic brothers and sisters? So it could just turn into an absolute failed state mess, refugee crisis, you name it. And that is a very, very real risk when you look at a failed state and when you look at arming people for what is, for some of them, a sectarian conflict.
Yes, and we know that those different ethnic groups, well, they've always been troublesome amongst themselves, right? And with other of those groups, and a bit of a sort of top-down, trying to keep a lid on it. But of course, if you take the lid off, then it can all boil over. And just coming back to the other thing that you mentioned, I want to underscore it. The idea of, because of potentially failed states or all of this conflict, the drift of migrants trying to get away, and particularly swamping Europe again, is very real. And of course, there's this waking realization that the population migration processes over the last decade or two has been part of the inflationary problem and part of the social and economic issues that many European countries have now been facing, to the point where they've started to put up barriers to stop people actually coming through. So this migration fallout, as well as the fragmented nature of the country potentially, again, are very significant political and social issues, not just for the country itself, but much more broadly.
No, exactly. And I think it just needs to be sort of put into perspective as well, just how large of a population Iran has. Now, if you look at the pre-war population of Syria, Iran's is around about a little over 6 times larger than Syria's. Now, I think we all, well, maybe perhaps not all of us, but some of us remember back in the 2010s when you would see these trains coming from the Balkans and going into Central and Western Europe, filled with Syrian refugees.
Yep.
Now imagine that, but imagine that not only is there potentially going to be refugee flows, but one, you're talking about a completely failed state, not an ongoing civil war. A whole heap of people obviously stayed in Syria. Most of the population stayed in Syria. But if you're talking about a country 6 times larger and a full-on failed state, potentially, that scenario just blows Syria out of the water. It turns it into just such a massive, enormous crisis that realistically, if the Europeans have anything approaching 2 brain cells to rub together, they won't let it happen. At that point, you're better off pretending that it's 1900 and you're going to step in and you're going to just, for a little while, empire build to keep the entire situation from falling to pieces. Because the consequences of letting it happen would be worse.
Yeah, but I would observe that Trump and his team don't seem at all worried about sweeping up the mess afterwards, right?
No, well, therein lies the problem.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's one of the biggest issues with this. And now, don't get me wrong. I think it is, on one hand, a positive that they're looking at this situation and they're going, we don't want to put boots on the ground. We don't want to turn this into Iraq War 3.0. And that is positive. But if they're just going to lob crap downrange and just keep blowing stuff up until the Iranians give up, that could get very, very ugly. Because the thing is eventually you run out of deeply desirable targets. Because intelligence gathering is hard. You figured out where lots of this stuff is, and eventually you start running out of targets because you don't know where everything is. You end up having old intel, different things develop, and it becomes very, very difficult. And that's happened before. You see that with Afghanistan, and they just bugger off to the mountains, and then they just come out when they want to cause grief. So there's just that major issue there of just America just keeps bombing and bombing and bombing, gets bored and goes home. And the question is what does that scenario look like? Because they're not in. I mean, they don't seem to be in this for the long haul. But by the same token, I'm not sure if you've seen it, but some of the Middle East press is reporting on the fact that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and Pete Hegseth, who's the Secretary of War, have been fighting each other tooth and nail over whether or not they should put American boots on the ground. So this could all just get so much more challenging and complex than it already is, unfortunately.
Well, I would argue that some of the chaos we're seeing on the ground is also reflected in the chaos in and around the White House, right? Where, in fact, there are clearly different agendas and different people have different views about what the right answer is or isn't. And Trump actually comes out with different arguments and different stories, possibly based on who he last spoke with. So it does beg a very important question. And I said omni-channels in the start of the show, right? And this is a massive omni-channels, and it's going to continue for some time. And the fallout is, well, we can speculate about it, but it's unknowable at the moment. But it is pretty dramatic. But I suppose the other angle here is just coming back home for a second. We know that currently in Australia, things are not great anyway. So it's not like we're starting from a pinnacle of greatness from an economics perspective, that households are feeling really great about themselves and they've got plenty of disposable income. We're actually starting this when households are already under the gun.
No, exactly right. This is an interesting chart that I put together based on the national accounts. And what this shows is household consumption per capita as deflated by the working age population. And as you can see, compared with when the Albanese government came to power, it is lower today than it was then. Now, Q2 2022 is also quite handy because that's also when broad-based growth started to come to a close. So that's why I quite like it as a sort of stepping off point from which to do these various analyses. And as you can see here on the chart, household consumption per capita rose quite strongly in the second quarter of last year and actually did quite well. But now we've seen that, unfortunately, begin to fall back. And I think it's just worth noting as well that, as Martin mentioned, that the household expenditure indicator of this year has been quite a bit weaker. And the data from the national accounts, which is only up to the end of the December quarter of last year, was already showing something of a deterioration. So while Australia may be getting ahead on paper in terms of the latest GDP figures, in terms of the per capita performance, it's a whole lot different. And as we've previously discussed, the problem is this is an aggregate indicator. There are people who are getting ahead and doing very well for themselves, but then there are a lot of other people who I would suggest are likely in the majority who are falling behind.
Absolutely. And I always highlight this idea of averages mask. And, the data from the ABS on household spending was actually just an aggregate, didn't tell you anything about the distribution or dispersion. And again, in my surveys, I see that there's a really, really big difference. So there are some people doing it okay, but also a lot of people not doing it at all well. And I guess that translates possibly to why we're seeing a lot of people saying, well, politically speaking, I think we need an alternative. And the latest poll numbers highlight that, One Nation is still looking like a real attractive alternative at the moment.
They are indeed, and this is of federal polling of One Nation's primary vote since September last year. And a lot of people have made various commentary that, oh, this pollster says this and this pollster says that. So I thought, you know what? Let's put all of them. Let's put all of them with a decent number of polls over I think I decided that it needed to be at least 4 polls from each source to include them, and chart it. And this is what we came up with. As you can see, One Nation has risen extremely strongly to, in some polls, be the second largest party by primary vote. And I just think it's worth noting that even some of the latest state level polling for state politics, One Nation is performing very, very strongly. In some cases, better than the Liberal Party. In some polls, even better than Labor in some states, which is frankly just an absolutely seismic shift in the plates that underpin Australian politics.
Yes, and I have a feeling that with the Albanese position on what's going on in Iran and beyond and the military and all those things, there'll probably be more people dischuffed with his party. The other side of politics is still, I think they're still destroying themselves rather than actually building at the moment. So my expectation, I think, is that One Nation will continue to be a bit of a beacon, whether it's a vote for something or a vote against something is actually, for me, a really interesting question. Is it really a protest vote? Is it simply saying, well, you're all stupid, so we're going to, vote for those people? Is the interesting question. But it looks to me as though the base of support is widening.
It is. Someone posted this great chart, and if someone knows who it was, just let us know in the comments. I forget who it was, but they posted this great chart that shows that One Nation's share of the two-party preferred vote against Labor, that if you chart that over time against the share of the vote for the voice referendum, it tracks very, very strongly. It's this permeation of an idea of, in that instance, it was the no vote. In this instance, it's the sort of, seismic shift in who people will give their primary vote to. So I think that's a really, really interesting, just from an academic perspective of just how a support for a movement or for a party that is an upstart evolves over time. And it does make me wonder, like, where exactly the limit is for one nation, because they've gone from, 6.4% of the vote at the last federal election to, in some cases, pushing up towards almost 30% of the vote in the most generous polls. So there's, where does the limit, where is the limit? And also, one of the things I thought was really interesting was some state level polling from Redbridge that came out. The granular data came out for that today, and it really raised the possibility for me that you could see, in the right set of circumstances, the coalition, if it manages to get its act together, do actually relatively okay in the cities, where One Nation ends up hitting Labor hard in the regions. And that's in Victoria, which is, generally speaking, considered to be one of the most left-leaning states. So you wonder how that's going to translate into other states. Although it could, to be completely fair, that could just be part of the fact that it is a very, very long-toothed government.
Yes. Well, we'll watch and wait and see how that plays out, and perhaps the overlay of Iran and everything is going to actually have an impact as well. Who knows? But what we do know is that the housing interventions from the government have had precisely the effect that, well, maybe there's no surprise, right? So particularly entry-level houses.
Indeed, this graph I made using the data from the 2026 Domain First Home Buyer Report. Now, what this does that's a little bit different to some of the others, say, for example, the Totality Report, which I referenced last year, is that it shows the relative pricing of a home in the 25th percentile by value, which means that 75% of homes are more expensive than this. Now, this I've done of house prices based on various different capital city locales, and to what degree they've grown in the last 5 years. And just for a little bit of perspective, I've tacked on in the end there the level of wages growth over the same period of time that Domain has assessed. And I think it just really illustrates the absolute impossibility of the median household being able to keep up with housing prices rising in this manner. And I think as well, a little bit further perspective is required, in the sense that this is based on comparing two snapshots of the present versus five years ago, which is towards the start of 2021. Now, in 2021, you could get a sub 2% 3-year fixed rate mortgage, whereas today, a lot of people are paying around 6% on their mortgages. So not only have prices risen at a rate far faster than wages in these entry-level parts of the housing market, but the ability to be able to pay for those entry-level homes because of the rise in interest rates has gotten far, far harder again than these numbers would suggest, which is frankly scandalous.
Well, it's reflective of my survey data, which shows that the proportion of disposable income that people are actually spending to house themselves, in fact, whether you're in the rental sector or whether you're actually in the mortgage sector, continues to rise. And we're seeing not 25, but 35, 45, 55, in some cases as high as 60% of disposable income just to house yourself. And that's before the next economic shock, incoming, as we discussed earlier.
No, exactly. I think realistically that this needs to be focused on far more heavily by the media and far more heavily by the political class. I mean, this sort of issue was once upon a time at the very least, it was the bread and butter of a party like the Greens. It was back when I was growing up, and it used to be the sort of thing Labor used to talk about. But now they're the ones in power doing the imposition of the unnecessary suffering, which I think is just deeply disappointing. I think that just from today's discussion that we've illustrated that there's already more than enough suffering in the universe as it is, without policymakers creating even more.
Well, I've spoken about Spin Jim before, and he's been at it again this last week, right? On the latest national accounts. Everything's great. Everything's fantastic. We're doing great. Look at that wages growth. It's all marvelous. When in fact, of course, the reality is that for ordinary people, it's just not. And I suspect that sort of impact of perspective of higher rates, the broader level of uncertainty, well, where would you see it? Well, maybe you see it in the clearance rates. And, I'm a very great skeptic of clearance rates, as you know, but you've got a different angle on clearance rates relative to the major companies and the way they report it.
I do indeed. Now, I've been collecting auction clearance rates on the Sydney auction market now for almost 8 years. And I every week, not every week, but most weeks when we've got an auction weekend, I put out a tweet on the auction clearance rates. Now, what ended up happening a number of years ago was SQM ended up putting out their auction clearance rates. Now, theirs are the gold standard.
Yep.
Mine is still very much a preliminary number that I come up with on a Saturday evening, whereas they chase up all the results and they end up coming up with the best possible picture of what auction clearance rates look like. Now, what I've done here with this particular chart is I've charted what auction clearance rates look like in the 5th weekend post Australia Day since the end of the pandemic. And as you can see here, the Sydney market is very, very weak compared with what has become the post-pandemic normal. And I'm just going to share a little quote here. Oftentimes when Louis Christopher, who's SQM's managing director, puts out his tweets, puts out the results on Twitter, he provides a little bit of commentary. Where is the market going? Where's the Sydney market going? Where's the Melbourne market going? If there's something interesting and worthy of comment. And this week he used, and I quote, that Sydney's auction market was pretty SHI expletive, and that basically that it's very much in the danger zone of falling home prices if this was to be continued over a protracted period. So looking at this from another perspective, which Tim Lawless from Totality, formerly known as CoreLogic, did in their recent house price report, he reported that there was a significant increase in the number of new listings coming to market in both Sydney and Melbourne. Now, it's worth noting that overall listing volumes are still deeply, deeply depressed compared with the 2010s era norms. But even just this little uptick of, I think the highest number he said was about 12% year on year in new listings has been enough to take the wind out of the sails of the Sydney auction market, and even out of the sales of the Melbourne auction market to a degree. So we're entering this kind of interesting situation where finally the auction market is looking a bit shaky, and there could be some rather interesting issues on the road ahead. And just before I forget, if you look at the data from Totality on what the different segments of the market are doing, the segments of the market that are below the Albanese government's price cap for the 5% deposit scheme, they're doing a whole lot better.
Mm.
And in some cities, I believe it was in Sydney, in the areas above the price cap, house prices are falling already. And that was for the that was for the 4th quarter of last year. So we've got a real interesting ball game on our hands, I feel. And I do wonder to what degree the number of people who were going to buy with that scheme has already, if that peak has perhaps already passed.
Well, I've always believed that that 5% deposit scheme was really not allowing a lot of new people to get in. It was allowing people who were already close to just to bring it forward slightly. So it was always going to be pulling stuff forward. But when you actually look at housing affordability now and the recent interest rate rises and the ratios that you need to be able to borrow, actually a lot of people still can't borrow sufficiently to be able to get into the market. But the other angle here is we are seeing more property investors. There are some buying, but there are also some now selling, particularly in Melbourne, actually, because there's now an expectation of home prices beginning to slide. They've had a run up in some cases, they've gone a bit sideways. So now they're looking perhaps to pull those out, because the rules and regs about the investment property game, and particularly around in Melbourne with land tax and other things, it's making it harder and harder for property investors to make any sort of return on property, whereas returns from stock markets or even on term deposits are actually safer and perhaps more predictable. So I think that we could well be at the very early point of an inflection in property, then overlay our earlier conversation, right? Because the property market, folks, it doesn't exist in a complete vacuum. It does exist in the same world that we discussed earlier on, where oil prices are very high, where there's global uncertainty. And that could translate into a whole bunch of phenomena. One of them is we might find some of those people with money from the Asian areas coming down to Australia as a more safe place, so that might put more demand. But on the other hand, the broader uncertainty, higher interest rates and everything else could actually be dampening as well. So, and it's interesting, if you look back in the 1970s, when we had the run-up in oil prices, that put a significant brake on home prices in a lot of different markets around the world. So maybe we're going to see the same again. So massive amounts of uncertainty, Tarek, is my conclusion.
Indeed, that's actually an interesting one. I'm going to have to look into a little bit of the what happened with the 1970s property markets. Sounds like something interesting.
Yes, there's always more to find out.
No, definitely. It's. I think it's going to be just. I think the problem with conversations surrounding Australian property is that it used to be, at least to a significantly greater degree, a discussion about fundamentals, about supply, about demand, about interest rates, about all these different, about immigration, about all these different factors that act on the property market. But I feel like in 2026, it's how much money are the government going to throw at it? What sort of crazy crap are they going to do to prop up the market? And, I think it was Shane Oliver who once said that everyone coming into Australia should have a piece of paper with their new passport that guarantees that property prices will go up. So it's really problematic. People say, "Oh, well, what do you think's going to happen with the property market?" And well, it depends what Albo's going to do.
Yeah.
It depends on how much of our money he's going to blow to make the lives of people who aren't property owners, to make our lives harder. So, unfortunately, that's what it comes down to.
Well, the federal public debt is crossing the 1 trillion, and the costs of debt are continuing to rise. The federal, state, and local authority spending as a proportion of GDP is as high as I think it's been. Nothing to see here, huh?
Well, that's the thing, mate. Is this is the government-powered economy. Government has gotten larger and larger and larger and larger over time here in Australia, and it's not just under the Albanese government. This has been happening now for, I believe it's the best part of 13 years, that government as a proportion of GDP, when I say government, I say day-to-day government, has been getting larger and larger and larger and larger. And I think part of the problem is that we've arrived at this situation where government is the economy. Now, if you were to embark hypothetically on a set of circumstances where you were going to return the size of government to the same range it was in between the mid-1980s and the early 2010s, and you wanted to return it to roughly the middle of that range over, let's call it a decade, you're going to have a recession. You can't do it. And not only that, but cutting the jobs that are taxpayer funded is also going to be challenging, because a lot of these people are going to have the skills and the experience in roles that in a lot of cases are not applicable in the private sector. And they're especially not applicable in the private sector in the age of the rise of AI, because a lot of them are those white collar jobs. If you're someone who can work with your hands and you're good at what you do, chances are you can always find a job doing something. Even if it's just going around mowing lawns for the local council. But if you're a specialized white collar worker and you've made your bread and butter working for the government, finding a job is going to be a whole lot harder. So it's this addiction cycle of, we're in the situation where the government is now enormous and the government is the economy, but we want growth. Well, how are we going to get growth? Well, we've got to make the government larger. So it's very, very difficult to stop. And I suspect that once that becomes especially clear from an economic perspective, that it's going to be very, very challenging for whoever's in power at the time to be able to rein this in. I mean, I think Britain is a very good example of this. Britain, where government got larger and larger and larger and larger, and you've got all these people, far too many people who are effectively useless, let's be honest, who are not generating sufficient enough value to justify their employment. And then the government, instead of sacking those people, some of whom are politically aligned, I might add, they turned around and they went, you know who we really don't need? Police officers and firemen, and to grow the NHS at the appropriate rate for nurses and ER doctors. We don't need those people, right? So they ended up cutting the things that they need to pay for the things that they don't. And I really don't see anything different in the DNA of Australia's political class to suggest that our experience is going to be any different.
No, it's about priorities and how understanding how different priorities coming from the political class and how they think versus ordinary people and what they think are important. They just want the economy to work and they want to be able to see a GP when they need to and get into hospital if they need to. All of those basic things, schools, transport, etc., etc. But it's like there's a parallel universe somewhere with a different set of rules that a relatively small proportion of the population, or the growing population, has a different set of rules. I'll just make one final point. All of these things are going to have an inordinate amount of impact on younger cohorts. So people trying to get into the work world, trying to form a family, trying to buy a house. And so this dispersion issue is ever more important because the bad decisions that governments are making are hitting younger cohorts particularly badly. And again, I don't think there's enough coverage of this in the media because a lot of it's just an aggregate story. Or worse, it's actually written by people who are actually sort of thinking, well, things are quite good. I've got my share portfolio. I've got my portfolio of properties, my investment properties. Things are looking quite good. But there's this very, very important segment of the population who are caught and trapped on all sides.
No, you're absolutely right. And part of the problem is that we don't have the data. I mean, like we've got your data, and we've got some other data from private providers. Say, for example, the Commonwealth Bank has some quite good data, granular data, but we don't have the level of granular data that we need to really look at the distributional issues. And that is a huge, huge problem because it's like, take the 25 to 34 age demographic, right? They are a demographic that has gone backwards enormously in terms of their real spending. If you look at, say, for example, as I said, the CommBank IQ data, they've experienced a literal technical depression in their spending.
Yep.
Right? So, but then the question is, then you take a step back further, right? The data from the RBA on spending goes back to 2003, 2004, based on an ABS data set, right? Now, they are spending less today if you factor in the CommBank IQ developments. Then they are spending less in real terms today, more than 10% less than they were in 2003, 2004. They've been absolutely decimated. And, not only that, but what does that distribution look like? Think about how much more educated, how much more how much more progress should have been made in those cohorts over time, or even the fact that today there's a significantly larger proportion of them working more than one job. All these different factors, a higher employment to population ratio, all of these various factors that should, on paper, be creating better outcomes for them aren't. And I just think that we really need to understand this, because this is how societies are undermined. Because if you look at suffering societies, right? You look at, say, for example, Britain during the Second World War. Things were rough. Things were rationed. Almost everything was rationed. People, and not only that, but you also had to deal with bombs falling from the sky and wondering if your father or your brother or your cousin or or whatever was going to come home from the war. But because they had a shared purpose and they had shared suffering, they came together. And that's what people have done numerous times throughout history. But the problem that we have in the present here in Australia is that you've got a lot of people getting ahead. You've got a whole lot more people falling behind. And that is a whole lot more difficult when you've got people going, they go down the shops, they walk down the street past a restaurant, and they see a bunch of people, generally older, more affluent people, all chowing down, wearing 15 grand watches and driving 150 grand cars. And they're struggling to put food on the table. That's what causes social problems. That complete divergence in outcomes. It's social cohesion undermining.
No, I agree. And the stuff we've been talking about earlier on is all part of this greater question of how things are going to shake down. And unfortunately, the negative impact specifically, is not going to be equally shared. And, it's very much has always been like this, but it's like this in spades at the moment. So it's important we talk about this stuff. Tarek, thank you so much for all the work you do on the slides. And I guess we'll compare notes again, maybe in a couple of weeks. And who knows what's going to happen by then?
Yeah, I'm sure. Well, we've been doing this now for, I think it was over 6 years now.
Yep.
And we said very many moons ago that maybe we live in interesting times, and they're getting more interesting.
Well, they certainly are, but at least that means there's going to be more to talk about. Tarek, thank you so much. Have a good weekend, and we'll see you next time.
No worries, mate. You too, and to all the viewers.
Cheers.